The plasma bolt tore through the midnight fog of Beta Outpost Epsilon, slicing the frozen air with a shriek that echoed off jagged cliffs of volcanic glass. Explosions lit up the barren landscape like false dawns, casting wild shadows across the skeletal remains of dead forests and abandoned human outposts, their crumbling walls graffiti-tagged with desperate messages. Hold the line. Earth never dies. No retreat. Sirens wailed through the night, long, ululating screams that rattled the bones of every soldier crouched behind the blackened rocks and rusted wreckage. In the midst of the chaos, Captain Riker Voss, a man weathered by too many lost wars and too few victories, slammed another power cell into his rifle and barked into his comms, "Tertiary fallback point! Move! Move!" His voice was hoarse but unyielding, a lifeline in the drowning storm. Around him, humanity's battered soldiers scrambled through mud and blood, dragging wounded comrades, setting up makeshift barricades from scrap and shattered dreams. They had no reinforcements, no exit plan. They would either hold Beta Epsilon, or they would die here. But not everyone on that battlefield was human. Half hidden in the wreckage of a fallen comms tower, a figure watched with wide, unblinking eyes. Tall and willowy, with skin the color of storm-lit oceans and hair that shimmered like mercury, Soren of the Aelari gripped a battered particle rifle awkwardly in hands never meant for such crude instruments. The Aelari, an ancient species of philosophers, artisans, and genetic architects, had long dismissed humanity as reckless brutes. Dangerous children playing with fire they scarcely understood. Soren had once shared that disdain. It had been bred into him, stitched into his mind like a second skin. And yet, here he was, standing shoulder to shoulder with them in the mud and fire. He felt the cold seeping through his armor, smelled the acrid stink of scorched metal and fear, heard the low, desperate prayers muttered by soldiers who knew death was stalking them through the smoke. And somewhere deep inside, past the carefully engineered logic and pride of his upbringing, Soren felt something stir, something irrational, something dangerous. He cared. Before we jump into this epic tale, subscribe to HFY Chronicles for the most intense sci-fi battles, legendary warriors, and universe-shaking wars. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join the fight. The memory came to him unbidden, a dusty night years ago, on a broken Earth. It had been a mission of pity, sanctioned by the Council of Stars. Human society was collapsing. Their cities had become tombs of glass and steel. Soren had walked the shattered streets of old Seattle, disdain curdling his stomach at the primitive desperation clinging to every crumbling wall. It was there, in the ruins of a forgotten plaza, that he stumbled upon a relic, an ancient device no bigger than his palm. A playback unit, old, cracked, barely functioning. He had activated it out of idle curiosity. Music. It spilled out in broken, static-choked bursts, an old Earth ballad sung by a voice full of heartbreak and impossible hope. The language was alien to him, yet the emotion, raw, bleeding, defiant, pierced straight through the layers of genetic conditioning and cold Aelari intellect. For the first time in his long life, Soren felt something he could not classify, could not quantify. He sat for hours amidst the ruins, playing that recording over and over as the stars burned cold and indifferent above. Imagine encountering a species so tragically flawed, so agonizingly mortal, and yet so stubborn in their belief that they could reach something greater than themselves. Imagine hearing the sound of a broken world singing to the stars, not with rage or surrender, but with aching, incandescent yearning. In the centuries that followed, Soren carried that battered guitar pick, a relic left beside the player, as a secret talisman, an admission he could never speak aloud, a tiny rebellion against everything he had been taught. And now, on Beta Epsilon, as plasma bolts screamed past and the sky cracked open with the roar of Veltraxian gunships, Soren understood. Humanity's greatest weapon was not their ships, nor their soldiers, nor even their terrifying unpredictability. It was their soul, their relentless, messy, infuriating refusal to give up on dreams, even when the universe offered nothing but despair in return. A cry shattered his reverie. One of the human soldiers had been pinned down by a collapsing barricade, the Veltraxians closing in. Without thinking, without calculation, Soren moved. He sprinted through the maelstrom of fire and smoke, ducking plasma shots that scorched the air centimeters from his head. His alien muscles, stronger and faster than human ones, lifted the heavy debris with ease. He hauled the soldier free, an 18-year-old boy, bloodied but alive, and shoved him toward the fallback line. The boy stared at him, wide-eyed. "Thanks, man," Soren nodded once, awkward, unsure. "Stay alive," he rasped, the human words thick on his tongue. As he turned back toward the front lines, he felt a heavy hand clap his shoulder. Captain Voss stood there, face grimy, armor scorched, but eyes sharp with something like gratitude. No words were exchanged, none were needed. In that moment, trust was forged stronger than any diplomatic treaty. But the ground shook violently beneath their feet. A thunderous rumble that sent men and machines sprawling. Overhead, a Veltraxian orbital lance had locked onto their position. A searing beam of energy, hot enough to vaporize steel, screamed down toward the outpost. Panic flared in the ranks. Weapons dropped. Screams tore through the night. Soren didn't think. He acted. With a deft flick of his wrist, he pulled a prototype from his belt, a compact deflector array he had scavenged and repaired from human ruins, adapting it with stolen Alari tech. He hurled it skyward. The device detonated mid-air, unfurling a shimmering shield of refracted energy that enveloped the battlefield just as the orbital lance struck. The impact was deafening, an artificial earthquake that flattened ancient trees and sent dust clouds roaring for miles, but the shield held, fractured, shuddering, screaming under the force. But it held. When the dust cleared, the human soldiers erupted into wild cheers, raw, hoarse sounds of survivors who had just stared death in the face and laughed. Soren sagged to his knees, every nerve singing with exhaustion, but a fierce smile curled his lips. In that moment, he was no longer Alari, no longer other. He was a brother in arms to the messy, reckless, beautiful chaos that was humanity. But Beta Epsilon was only the first ripple. Beyond the broken mountains, a darkness stirred. An ancient force that despised what humanity represented, that would stop at nothing to snuff out their defiant light. And Soren, once a mere observer, now found himself standing at the heart of the coming storm, willing to risk everything for the culture he had once dismissed, and the species he had come to call his own. The journey of transformation, sacrifice, and the collision of worlds was only just beginning. The calm after, the storm was always the hardest part. It wasn't the devastation, nor the corpses of fallen comrades that lingered in the aftermath. It was the silence, the eerie stillness that settled like a heavy blanket across the battlefield. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for the next wave to come crashing through. For Soren, that silence was deafening. As the human soldiers began the grim task of clearing the wreckage, patching wounds, and collecting what remained of their gear, Soren stood, at the edge of the shattered outpost, watching the twin moons rise slowly over the horizon. The distant glow of the Veltraxian retreat lingered in the atmosphere, flickers of light like dying stars. But it wasn't just the battle that weighed heavily on his mind. It was the choice he had made, the path he had unknowingly set himself upon. Back in the deep recesses of his ship, tucked far beyond the range of human detection, the Council of Stars had been watching. They always were. Their cold, calculating gaze had been upon Soren the moment he had stepped onto human soil. His orders were clear. Observe, learn, and report. Do not engage. Humanity was a threat, a wild card, unpredictable and dangerous. It was their lack of restraint, their emotional volatility, that made them a danger to the galaxy, a danger to their carefully ordered civilization. Soren had always believed that. He had always wanted to believe that. And then he had witnessed the resilience of human spirit, the sheer will that drove these creatures to survive, to fight against odds that would have broken any other species. It was maddening. It was beautiful. It was human. A memory sparked in Soren's mind, one of his first encounters with a human, a mere child, really. She had been standing on the edge of an abandoned cityscape, staring up at the sky. The child had been no older than 5 or 6. Dirt smeared her face, her clothes tattered and torn. She held a small, crumpled drawing in her hands. a child's, crayon interpretation of a starship flying amidst a bright constellation, a representation of hope. "Why do you keep fighting?" Soren had asked, his voice low, tinged with skepticism. "The war is lost. The Earth is dying." The girl hadn't answered immediately. She had simply looked up at him, her dark eyes full of a mixture of defiance and wonder. "Because we have to," she had said, her voice steady despite the trembling world around her. "We're not done. Yet. We can still do something. We have to keep trying." Soren had never forgotten those words. He'd heard them repeated countless times since, by soldiers on the front lines, by civilians hiding in the ruins, by generals standing in the ashes of their fallen cities. But it was the way the girl had spoken, with such quiet certainty, that had made him question everything. And now, standing amidst the wreckage of Beta Epsilon, surrounded by soldiers who had already begun to rebuild, to regather themselves, Soren could feel his convictions crumbling. The walls that had once separated him from humanity, the deep, hard line between us and them, were starting to blur. He had believed that the Elari were above such petty concerns, that their culture of peace, of intellectual pursuit, of detachment from the brutal realities of life, was the pinnacle of existence. But now, watching humanity claw its way out of oblivion time and time again, he wondered if perhaps it was they who were on the right path. "Captain Voss." The voice was low, controlled, but Soren could hear the urgency beneath it. He turned to find the human officer standing behind him, his face darkened by exhaustion but sharp with purpose. Voss didn't wait for a response before continuing. "We've lost comms with the outer colonies. Veltraxian fleets have gone dark. No signals, no traces. It's like they've disappeared." Soren's gaze shifted to the stars, the vast expanse that stretched endlessly above. The Veltraxians, mysterious, ruthless, and ancient, had been humanity's greatest threat for decades, a relentless force that sought to conquer, enslave, and eradicate. They had razed countless human colonies to the ground, left entire planets in ruin, and now they had vanished. It wasn't like them. They never retreated. They never gave up. "What do you think it means?" Voss asked, his voice betraying a rare note of uncertainty. Soren paused, his mind racing. The Veltraxians were a calculated species. Nothing they did was ever random. The galaxy had been watching, waiting for humanity to break. Every species that had encountered Earth's inhabitants had assumed the same thing, that they would fall apart. That humanity's violence, disarray, and lack of unified direction would be their undoing. But here they were, still standing, still fighting. "We're not dealing with a simple retreat," Soren finally said, his voice steady, but laced with a chill he couldn't quite suppress. "Something more ancient, more dangerous, is at play here." Voss's eyes narrowed. "You're saying they're running from something else?" Soren nodded slowly. "Yes. The Veltraxians are not known for fear. But they have a history buried deep in their archives. A secret they have never shared with anyone. There is a species, older than any we know. A race whose very presence can drive the Veltraxians to flee." Voss looked at Soren like he was speaking in riddles, but there was no time for elaboration. Not when they were facing an enemy who could shatter the fragile peace they had fought so hard to maintain. "We need to get to the bottom of this." "Fast," Voss said, his resolve solidifying. "We can't let whatever is out there take us by surprise." Soren knew what was coming. He had already seen it in his mind's eye. A race far older than any known empire. A darkness from the edges of the galaxy, beyond even the reach of the ancient Elari archives. They called themselves the Karos, and their sole purpose was annihilation. They did not leave survivors. And if they were the true threat, humanity's only chance of survival would be to face them head-on. As the human soldiers rallied and prepared for the unknown, Soren felt a deep, stirring sense of purpose, one that had nothing to do with the cold, calculated ethos of his people. He had never truly understood the human condition, the drive that kept them moving forward, no matter the cost. But now, standing alongside them, Soren realized that it wasn't just about survival. It was about meaning. The human quest for meaning was a force of nature. And as he stood there, surrounded by these fierce, flawed creatures, he could no longer deny the truth. It was a quest he wanted to be part of. The stars above seemed to flicker in response, as if to affirm this new path he had chosen. The war was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. But now, for the first time, Soren had a reason to fight. And that reason was not just survival. It was hope. The tension on the command deck of the Valor's Light was palpable. The sleek, matte black warship hummed with quiet energy, its engines pulsing beneath the floor plates. The crew, hardened by years of combat, were a mixture of focused concentration and barely contained anxiety. They all knew what was coming. The Veltraxians had retreated, yes, but that didn't mean they were safe. Not when something older, something darker was lurking in the fringes of their galaxy. Captain Voss stood at the center of the bridge, his sharp gaze scanning the hollow screens that flickered with data streams and tactical maps. The image of the Veltraxian fleet's sudden disappearance had been burned into his mind. Where had they gone? And more importantly, why had they left? No one could answer that question, not yet. But one thing was certain. The Karos, the forgotten predators of the galaxy, were stirring, and their return was nothing short of catastrophic. As the human crew prepared for the unknown, Soren stood near the rear of the bridge, watching with a mixture of intrigue and wariness. He had never fully embraced the human way of war, the chaotic emotional intensity with which they approached conflict. He had observed their brutality, their violence, the way they clung to life even in the face of certain destruction. But now, in the presence of this new threat, he saw something else. A cold, methodical precision in their determination. They weren't merely surviving. They were preparing for something far more dangerous. "I don't like this," Voss muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "If the Veltraxians are scared of these Karos, then we're all in trouble. And that means the stakes just got a hell of a lot higher." Soren's mind raced, pulling fragments of ancient knowledge from the deepest recesses of his species. Archives. The Karos were not a name spoken lightly. A shadowy ancient race whose origins were lost to time. Their reputation was one of utter annihilation. In every known record, they were described as a race of hunters, relentless, unstoppable, and possessing technology that was light years ahead of any known species. "Captain," Soren spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I believe the Veltraxians' retreat is no coincidence. The Karos are not simply an old myth. They are real, and they are coming." Voss turned slowly, his brow furrowed, in disbelief. "You're telling me that an ancient race, one we've never even encountered before, is now a legitimate threat?" "I'm telling you," Soren replied, his voice steady but urgent, "that they are more than just a threat. They are a force of nature. And if the Veltraxians are running, it means they've encountered something they cannot defeat." Voss's gaze darkened. "But why us? Why now?" Soren paused, his mind shifting through the endless data he had accumulated on the Karos over the years. "Because, Captain, we are a species unlike any other. We are unpredictable. We are wild. The Karos thrive on destruction, yes, but they also thrive on the chaos that follows. The unscripted nature of our existence makes us their perfect prey." The bridge grew even quieter as the crew absorbed Soren's words. For the first time, the vastness of the danger before them felt more real than the battle they had just fought. The stars beyond the Valor's Light now seemed less like distant points of light and more like beacons marking the path of a coming storm. And Soren couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was more than just a fight for survival. It was a test, one that would either forge humanity into something far greater or destroy them entirely. Voss turned to the crew. "Prepare the ship for deep space travel. We need to find the Veltraxian fleet before they regroup, and we need to do it fast." His voice was filled with the calm authority of a man who had faced insurmountable odds and lived to tell the tale. But even he knew that this was different. This time, the stakes were beyond anything they had ever imagined. Soren moved closer to the captain, his eyes narrowing as he examined the star maps once more. "We will need to be cautious. The Karos are not like the Veltraxians. They do not engage in battle for sport. They are precise, calculated, and their technology is unlike anything we've ever encountered. If we are to survive, we must think beyond conventional tactics. Voss nodded slowly. I'm listening. The Karos are masters of stealth, Soren continued, his mind already whirring with possibilities. They have cloaking technologies that can render entire fleets invisible to even the most sophisticated sensors. We will not be able to track them the same way we did with the Veltraxians. And unlike the Veltraxians, they do not engage in full-scale wars. They strike swiftly, without warning, and then vanish. Their warships are equipped with weaponry that can obliterate entire planets with a single strike. Voss clenched his fists, his face hardening. Then we need to strike first. Take the fight to them. Soren's gaze met Voss's, and for a brief moment, there was a shared understanding between them. Humanity was not about to wait for extinction to come knocking. They would not cower before this ancient enemy. They would fight. Indeed, Soren said softly. But we must be smart. The Karos are ancient. They know how to exploit every weakness. If we make a misstep, I get it, Voss interrupted, a steely resolve setting in his voice. We'll be smart, and we'll be ready. Humanity doesn't go down easily. Soren's heart stirred at the words, though he tried to suppress it. The human spirit, that indomitable will to survive, was something he had underestimated time and time again. And now, standing alongside these warriors, he knew something had shifted inside him. No longer was he simply an observer. He had a role to play in this battle. The Aeleri may have taught him the value of logic, but humanity had shown him the power of heart. As the Valor's light slipped silently into the void of deep space, Soren's mind raced with the implications of what lay ahead. They were about to engage in a war unlike any other. A war where victory would not come from superior firepower or strategy, but from the raw, unrelenting will to survive. And perhaps, just perhaps, humanity had what it took to overcome the darkness of the Karos. The crew braced for impact, each member preparing for the unknown that lay beyond the stars. And as Soren glanced out at the endless expanse, he could not help but wonder. What would happen when humanity's spirit collided with the cold, unstoppable force of the Karos? Only time would tell. The deep silence of space was both a sanctuary and a threat, a vast expanse of emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. The Valor's light moved through it like a shadow, its sleek form cutting through the void at incredible speeds. Inside the warship, the crew worked in near-perfect synchrony, preparing for the unimaginable. The stakes had never been higher. Not only were they racing against an ancient enemy, but they were also testing the very core of what made humanity a force to be reckoned with in the galaxy. Soren stood near the central command panel, his gaze fixed on the holographic map of the galaxy. The Veltraxian fleet's sudden disappearance had set off a chain reaction that now had them hunting in the dark, desperate to piece together the fragments of a puzzle they weren't even sure they had all the pieces for. The Karos, the ancient predators, had been awakened. And they were coming. Status report. Voss's voice cut through the tension, commanding attention. Soren turned from the map and approached the captain. We're on track to intercept the Veltraxian fleet in 4 hours. If we continue at this pace, we'll be within striking distance of their last known location. His voice was calm, but the undercurrent of uncertainty was undeniable. He didn't need to be a human to sense the gravity of the situation. Voss nodded, though his expression remained hard, calculating. What's the probability the Karos are already aware of our presence? Soren hesitated. High. The Karos do not need the conventional means of detection. They can sense disturbances in the fabric of space itself. It's possible they've known of our movements since we first set course toward the Veltraxians. A grim silence followed his words. It was a sobering realization. Their very presence may have already been flagged by an enemy far more advanced than any they had ever faced. The Karos had not relied on advanced technology alone to dominate their enemies. They had honed their instincts, their senses, and their predatory nature over millennia. They understood the intricacies of the universe in ways humanity was still learning. Soren felt a stir of discomfort as he thought back to the old records of Karos engagements. Their strikes were always surgical, swift, and precise. They would never approach their prey head-on. No. They would slip through the shadows of space, waiting, watching. They struck when the moment was right, picking apart their prey with terrifying efficiency. The Veltraxians had learned this the hard way, but there was one thing Soren had not yet shared with the crew, something even he didn't fully understand. The Karos had a singular obsession, an obsession with something they had never encountered before in their millennia of conquest. Humanity. It's not just our unpredictability they're drawn to, Soren said quietly, as if the words themselves held a weight he was only now beginning to grasp. It's our potential. The Karos feed on the chaos we create, but more than that, they seek to break what they cannot understand, and humanity is an enigma. Voss turned sharply, narrowing his eyes. You're saying we're more than just prey? Soren's gaze darkened. Yes. They don't just want to destroy us. They want to dominate us, to mold us into something they can control. But that's where they're wrong. We don't break easily. We evolve. We adapt. And that, Captain, is something they haven't accounted for. A low hum filled the air as the ship's engines shifted in response to the captain's orders. The tension in the room seemed to increase with every passing second. They were now entering the region of space known as the Fringe, a vast and largely unexplored territory where the stars burned with an eerie, faint glow. The remnants of ancient star systems lingered here, their shattered remains scattered like forgotten memories. The very air felt different here, thin and crackling with the energy of long-dead worlds. Soren watched the swirling nebulae outside the viewport, the colors shifting and changing in mesmerizing patterns. It was a beautiful, haunting sight. The stars themselves seemed to speak of a time long before human history, a time when the galaxy had been wild, untamed, and full of unknown dangers. As the crew prepared for their inevitable encounter with the Karos, the mood aboard the Valor's Light shifted. The same crew that had once been filled with the fire of a relentless desire to survive now faced something far more insidious. The Karos were not just invaders, they were hunters. And to them, humanity was nothing more than the latest challenge, in their never-ending search for the ultimate prey. Soren felt the weight of that truth settle into his bones. The Karos were not concerned with the success or failure of this battle. To them, victory was inevitable. They didn't need to win. They just needed to break humanity, to unravel the very core of what made them a force to be reckoned with. And that, Soren realized, was the moment of reckoning. If they were to survive this war, they would need to prove that humanity was not something that could be easily crushed. Voss paced in front of the tactical display, his brow furrowed in thought. Soren, you said the Karos are relentless, but how do we beat something that has no weakness? We don't, Soren replied, his voice low. We don't beat them. We survive. And we fight back. His words were filled with a quiet intensity, a fire that burned deep within him, a fire that he had learned to embrace through his time with humanity. We use what they don't understand. We use our unpredictability, our instinct. Humanity fights with its heart, not just its mind. And that, Captain, is something they'll never be prepared for. The captain nodded slowly, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his lips. So we're going to surprise them. Soren returned the smile, though his thoughts were far from light. Surprise them, confuse them, and when they underestimate us, he let the words hang in the air, filled with the promise of something far more than just survival. The Valor's Light continued its journey, the stars beyond growing brighter with each passing second, as if they were drawing closer to an inevitable confrontation. But Soren couldn't help but feel that, despite the overwhelming odds, something had shifted. The humans had proven time and time again that they could defy expectations, and in this battle for their survival, they would prove it once more. It was not about winning, it was about fighting back. And in the face of an enemy like the Karos, that was a victory in and of itself. The battle began in silence. At first, the Valor's Light was a flicker on the horizon, a faint pulse of light in the vast, impenetrable blackness of the Fringe. But within moments, that faint pulse erupted into a storm of chaos and fury. The Karos ships arrived without warning, blades of obsidian in the void, their dark hulls gleaming like polished stone. Their presence was felt before it was seen, as if the very fabric of space had bent to accommodate their arrival. Soren's breath caught in his throat as the first wave of Karos warships appeared on the tactical display. Hundreds of ships, each one a nightmare of sleek, jagged lines, designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Their sheer size was enough to make the Valor's light look insignificant, a mere speck in the shadow of their monstrous forms. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, Soren stood firm, his eyes steely with determination. This was the moment humanity had prepared for. This was their test. "Captain," Voss's voice rang out, calm but urgent. "We've lost contact with the Veltraxian fleet. They've vanished from our sensors." "Of course they have," Soren muttered, barely able to keep his anger in check. The Veltraxians had been their allies, but now they were nothing more than a faint memory. It was humanity's turn to take the lead. But the Karos didn't care about alliances or treaties. To them, this wasn't a war. It was a hunt. And they were the predators, circling in on their prey. The Valor's light shuddered as it entered the first wave of fire, the hull vibrating under the immense heat of plasma shots and ion bursts that slashed through the emptiness. Soren's gaze snapped to the main viewport, watching as brilliant streaks of green and red lightning flashed across the darkness. The Karos were not subtle in their attack. They were precise, ruthless. Their weapons sent ripples through space itself, warping the fabric of reality with each devastating hit. "Defensive. Shields at 70%, one of the officers reported, his voice tinged with panic. But even in the face of imminent destruction, Soren could see the crew's resolve hardening. Humanity was not about to be wiped away by an unstoppable enemy. They were going to fight back. Fight harder than they ever had before. The Valor's light lurched violently as the Karos continued their relentless assault. Soren's body slammed against the walls of the bridge, his head spinning with the force of the impact. But he didn't let himself falter. He couldn't. Not now. The Karos had no intention of negotiating. They had no interest in humanity's survival. This was an extinction event, and the humans aboard the ship knew it. This was the fight for everything they had ever stood for. "Prepare countermeasures," Voss barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "We're not going down without a fight." The crew sprang into action, their movements swift and coordinated, despite the violence of the battle. The ship's engines roared as they boosted forward, darting through the maelstrom of fire and fury. The Valor's light wasn't just a ship. It was an embodiment of humanity's will to survive. Soren felt it in every maneuver, every sharp turn of the ship, every weapon fired in retaliation. The Karos would learn what it meant to face an enemy that refused to break. "Target their flanks," Soren ordered, his voice cutting through the storm. "We need to outmaneuver them," the bridge crew responded instantly. With a speed and precision that belied the ship's size, the Valor's light swung around, its powerful ion cannons charging. In a single coordinated strike, they unleashed a torrent of devastating energy that tore through the hull of the nearest Karos ship. The explosion was brilliant, a flash of light that briefly illuminated the surrounding void. It was a victory, a small one, but a victory nonetheless. But the Karos were not so easily deterred. The first ship's destruction only seemed to enrage them. They retaliated with a ferocity that could only be described as a primal, instinctual response. The remaining Karos ships closed in, their weapons unleashing wave after wave of destruction. For every shot the Valor's light landed, the Karos seemed to adapt, evolving their tactics, countering each maneuver with something new, something unexpected. In the thick of the battle, Soren's mind raced. The Karos had seen countless species before. They had wiped out civilizations, toppled empires, and reduced entire star systems to ash. But none of those had been human. None of them had fought with the same relentless drive, the same refusal to back down. Soren understood it now. It wasn't just about fighting. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about sending a message. Humanity would not be cowed. Humanity would not be erased. And no matter how many times the Karos struck, humanity would always rise. The will to live, the drive to protect what was theirs was more powerful than any weapon, any alien species, or any predator. The battle raged on, the ship now battered but unyielding. In the control room, the hum of the engines blended with the sound of weapons firing, the constant thrum of life itself. Every strike, every blast, was a testament to humanity's strength. And as Soren watched the destruction unfold, he knew something deeper was happening. The battle was more than just about victory. It was a culmination of everything humanity had ever learned. As the battle reached its climax, the Karos began to falter. They were relentless, yes, but they were also blind in their arrogance. They had never encountered a species like humanity before, one that fought not just for survival, but for the very right to exist, to thrive, and to shape the future. In the face of such unyielding resistance, the Karos began to retreat, their ships slowly pulling back, as if unwilling to face a battle they could not predict, a battle where they could no longer dominate. Soren stood at the bridge, watching. As the Karos ships vanished into the distance, their once imposing forms fading into the cold expanse of space, the Valor's light had emerged victorious, but it had come at a cost. The damage to the ship was significant, and many of the crew were injured, but the message had been sent. Humanity had stood its ground, and in doing so, had proven that it could not be destroyed, could not be broken. "Report." Voss's voice broke through the moment, steady but filled with awe. "We've done it," the officer replied, his voice full of disbelief. "The Karos are retreating. The fleet is in disarray. We've won." Soren looked out at the vast expanse of space, the stars flickering quietly in the distance. He had always believed in humanity's strength, but today, he had seen it with his own eyes. Humanity had not just survived. They had defied the Karos, and in doing so, they had earned a place among the stars. "We've won," Soren whispered to himself. But even as he spoke, he knew that the war was far from over. The Karos would return, they always did, but next time, humanity would be ready.